Throughout history, nations debated with each other over issues of expansion and conquering, where diplomacy rarely worked through peaceful talks, conferences, or negotiations. Diplomacy was and has been obtained through force, such as guns as a means of securing the desired objectives in domestic and foreign policies. During the Civil War, Richard Gatling would have a revolutionary thought to invent the machine gun as a tool of diplomacy to save lives, not to end them. The sheer sight of a weapon so powerful and terrifying would cause the opposing side to submit, rather than waste more human lives, and an idea that carried well on to the 21st century. Weapons of any kind, from swords to guns, are generally viewed by the public as tools of evil and have caused quite heated debates. There is a great irony in this because from the earliest empires dating back to the ancient world, weapons of all shapes and sizes have been used as a tool of diplomacy to conquer a culture or to help achieve their agenda. As major battles and wars would be fought over the centuries, the narrative of using guns could and would be spun to fit the narrative of empires fighting one another. Diplomats from competing nations would talk or negotiate to try to come apart within kinesis, but when no agreement could be reached, guns or other weapons would be used as a tool to persuade others in submission. The author Julia Keller states that Americans are uncomfortable with the notion of granting guns such pride as place of instruments of death. If an empire or nation won, guns were not seen as a bad diplomatic tool. Leaders will use any means necessary when it comes to protecting their people or deterring any potential adversaries. Traditional ways of fighting with swords and shields versus guns showed that weapons had great power, especially when trying to conquer, invade, or take over other places. There were also the Middle Ages code, where chivalry that had influenced many European countries in battles with the ideas about honor, grandeur, nobility, status, and glory. Men would fight according to these certain ideologies, and guns would change what dying meant by these new weapons. Civilization would change. Fighting would never be the same. Men and soldiers didn't know how to respond to these new armaments that used gunpowder. The sheer sight of hand cannons versus swords and shields would have a great psychological impact on battles because men had to adapt to these new technologies. Nations and empires would continue to expand to retain world power, and armaments would continue to develop and be utilized because they helped win battles. The United States would not be any different from any empire released in the 18th century. Beginning with the Revolutionary and French and Indian War, muskets and cannons were used. The American colonists tried to reach a peaceful diplomatic process with the English, French, and natives, but in the end would fight, using guns to win. It was a forced diplomacy that the United States would continue to use well into the 1860s. In 1861, the Civil War would divide the new nation where no negotiations were taking place and war would force diplomacy. Muskets paired with the new invention, mini balls, would reveal a whole new way for bones and muscles to be shred apart. According to the American battlefield struck, when it struck a man, the ball caused considerable damage, oftentimes flattening upon impact. Many balls flattened bones, damaged muscle, and drove dirt, clothing, and other debris into the wounds. This caused extensive damage, and the wound would have a high chance of becoming contaminated, leading to an increase of a developed infection. On many battlefields, soldiers would quickly add up, and doctors and nurses had to act quickly. One of the main forms to save soldiers was to amputate for the best chance of survival. 80% of the soldiers in the Civil War were amputated. The National Museum of Civil War Defense said that estimates from both Confederate and Union sides for amputations are combined with about 50,000 amputations done throughout the war. Seeing the piles of dismembered limbs outside of medical tents due to a single bullet wound would have a traumatic effect on Gatling. He would witness this carnage of soldiers coming off trains with missing limbs or shredded body parts. The author Julia Keller explained, as stretcher after stretcher was pulled off railroad cars. Gatling watched the sick and wounded men on those stretchers as they twisted or withered or even more ominously lay still. More than 2/3 of the casualties in this war would be from disease, not combat. It was worse than a simple human tragedy, he thought. It was grotesque and a shameful waste. Gatling would hear about the first machine gun that fired rapid bullets to eliminate many men instead of a single person. The coffee mill gun was a weapon that the infamous Abraham Lincoln was aware of and endorsed. As many of the first-generation inventions, this weapon was forgotten over time since it had many flaws of overheating and jamming. As the war raged on, Gatling was overwhelmed by the disturbing images of young men, and he wanted to help end the war so no more young people had to suffer or die. He thought to himself, could a weapon have such intimidation that it caused an opponent to surrender? He had a humanitarian vision where he believed that the machine gun was an innovation to promote peace and convince men to quit fighting. In 1877, he wrote, "It occurred to me that if I could invent a machine gun, which could by its rapidity of fire enable one man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would, to a large extent, suspend the necessity of large armies and consequently exposure to battle and disease would be greatly diminished." Gatling promoted his hand-crank machine gun that could fire 700 to 1,000 rounds per minute, and saying it sparked fear into everyone. Anthony Smith described it as, "The new weapon was so fortunate, merely killing the sake of killing. Where was the luster in merely mowing down an enemy? Where was the excitement and the honor one might gain from fighting man to man?" This new device deserved no space where honor made the rules. It was not a proper instrument of war, being unworthy and unacceptable. Chivalry had died. It challenged many of the old ideas what it meant to be a soldier and proper ways of fighting, so much that many rejected using the machine gun. It also had to be pulled through rough terrain, which was difficult, and many did not know how to operate it. Only 13 Gatling guns would be sold to the Union during the Civil War, and many were not on the battlefield. Because of its physical size and the components of overheating, it would not be a desirable weapon as Gatling had hoped to hasten the end of the Civil War. It would not be until the outbreak of World War I in 1914, where the first time in human history the machine gun's potential would be recognized. Gatling's vision had come to fruition as Allies and Central Powers would both use the Gatling gun and newer versions, like the Maxim gun, in battle. According to Julia Keller, the Gatling gun changed everything. It was a pivot point in the invention of craftsmanship and brutal efficiency. That efficiency changed humans' conception of itself. For the first time in history, you can kill an enemy en masse. It did not have the diplomatic intentions Gatling had hoped for to shorten or end wars. Soldiers and armies would respond by not surrendering, but instead create a new type of warfare, trench fighting. Killing was only the consequence and not the purpose of the fight. Defeat the enemy, but keep within the rules. Knock out an opponent, do not murder him. Machine guns had to be resented and despised. They had adjusted the equation in favor of death, and they only served to kill. By the end of World War I, machine guns went through a huge change. Gatling's vision was twisted in the idea that nations now recognize the value of such a powerful weapon that they continue making them stronger and better. Gatling had grand visions that his new invention would help end the Civil War and save young men from dying slowly, living life dismembered. The only effect it had during his life was that it changed rules of warfare to mean something less personal. Today's society portrays guns with violence, negativity, and destruction. It is a paradox image where the U.S. is a nation of hope, freedom, and self-determination, but we use guns like the Gatling gun to achieve our empire. Yet with rare expansions, U.S. policymakers have found it difficult to achieve their objectives by threats alone. Oftentimes they have to use force, even if only in limited ways, to add strength to the words of diplomats. As peaceful diplomacy through talking and negotiation seem to escalate between diplomats and foreign nations, tools of diplomacy are being used more and more. The United States is guilty of using forced persuasion through armaments as diplomacy and cooperation are disappearing through our foreign policy. It is important that the U.S. should learn more towards cooperation and negotiation moving forward and only resulting in the force of weapons as a last resort. In the words of Secretary of State George Shultz in December 1984, diplomacy not backed by strength will always affect ineffectual at best, dangerous at worst. If you look at the history of the United States, guns have been used from our founding era into today as a tool to coerce our enemies into submission. It is woven into our history and is not labeled as a destructive or violent tool when used to our advantage. As the United States began expanding, it's realized its peaceful negotiations with other peoples or nations did not always work. In that case, weapons became a useful tool to persuade or, in extreme cases, force the opposition into submission. As Julia Keller explains, the same justification was embraced by the many scientists who hotwired America's atomic arsenal less than a century after Gatling created his gun. Using weapons to show strength of your nation is nothing new, and this tactic will be used over and over to reach diplomatic solutions. The invention of the machine gun was grounded with the right intentions from Richard Gatling to save lives during the Civil War. What he hoped for diplomatically would scare people into ending wars, actually reversed into the weapon radiating power. It would be modified to be far deadlier than he could ever dream. Nations around the world use machine guns to still try to scare enemies into submission.